Oh, hi there. Good to see you,
Hi.
Paul. What you been thinking about, hon?
Oh, well, I've been thinking about a lot of different things, but I just had a really wonderful conversation with Sherry and Seeking Genuine. And what I've been thinking about is the concept of alignment. And I think that it's a term, I don't know if like where you might find it a lot, but probably more in psychology or whatever. But I do think that it's a bit in the mainstream in terms of social media. But which is interesting because I'm trying to think now if I ever what my exposure and engagement with the term was when I was younger. Like, did I ever hear people talking about alignment? Um, so that would be interesting to think about. But um, yeah, I think it's a very interesting term, and I think it's also my conversation with Sherry and Megan shed a lot of great light on the t concept of alignment. But really generally it's a good thing, right? Like if you can live an aligned life with, well, aligned obviously means like aligned with what, right? Um, I guess that's how actually I kind of experienced that term more when I was younger. Like you hear about different people aligning with a certain ideology or political group or whatever. So I think that's how I knew it. But now as I'm in my 30s, it's more like I think about it in terms of the meaning of you living in alignment with yourself, which is maybe something that is like uh oh, like that's just shouldn't you naturally be aligned with yourself, right? Um, but the fact that it's developing a um like the fact that it's kind of in the mainstream in terms of art, that it's discussed and it's talked about and it's kind of thought about in terms of like the psychological implications is interesting to me. And I guess the big question is like, how do you, I mean, maybe this already shows how much we're kind of head on sticks in this day and age, but the question of like, how can you be sure that you're aligned, right, with your own, because again, alignment is talked about in terms of it being like a more optimal way of living, a more optimal way of being. And that makes sense because like let's just say with your spine alignment is essential to the functionality of your body and your well-being. So yeah, again, it's like being aligned is important. But what, you know, I think it just could be interesting to dig more into what that means. And the risk of having the concept is that people are afraid they're not aligned, right? And then they're like, maybe it's like the centipede concept, right? Where you suddenly ask, like, how are you walking or on all those legs? And then it doesn't know how to explain it. So it just stops. So, anyways, I was just trying to be a little bit more, uh, try to poke a little bit more at the concept of alignment. And then also think about what are the phenomenological, I don't know, spiritual, physical, mental, emotional things that would be the fruits, the fruits of alignment. So that's what I've been thinking about, Daniel.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm glad you got to speak with the wonderful Sherry and Seeking Genuine. That's divine. And
Yeah.
Daniel, Michael, Satori, wonderful to see everyone. I hope you're doing well on this fine day. No, that's interesting. Like, what exactly is alignment? Michelle was just mentioning
Yeah.
she had a talk with Sherry and Seeking Genuine on alignment. What is alignment? And then, of course, there's questions. Is that even a useful concept? Will that make you paranoid? Because you're like, oh, is this aligned or not? Am I not being my true self? Which can create various nervousness and often doesn't seem to be a very helpful concept. But what would it mean to be aligned? Which is also an interesting phrase because aligned, if I'm thinking like atheist, does aligned means you're not a straight line? You're actually aligned because you're more like a painting and you're not straight. Because it is funny how aligned kind of tends to think of a straight line, but maybe there's something playful. Well, actually, you're aligned when you're not like a straight. When you're not straight, you're textured, you're more dynamic, you're more able to actually almost like boogie board. I'm thinking about boogie boarding, or what is it called? When my older brother was really good when you jump on the board in the waves and it keeps going. I think that's boogie boarding. Or something like, and you're actually able to ride the waves. And I'll throw it to Daniel here, but it is interesting to think of alignment um, not perhaps so much as going in a straight line, but being able to ride whatever is thrown at you. Like it's more about a harmony with the waves than it is going straight. Because it is interesting how in our brain, I guess I'm just kind of riffing off the word, it's interesting how alignment makes us think straight. But that's kind of the technological essence, isn't it? That's like, because there are no straight lines in nature. That's really important. Like, there's no straight lines in nature. And in fact, like, if we look at West's book on scale, one of the reasons why cities and human creations don't follow natural scaling laws which can lead to destruction of the environment or like becoming too big and not really being energy efficient, is because humans can make straight lines. And straight lines don't, and smooth surfaces don't have natural scaling laws. And what he means by that, and it's getting into Mandelbrot and different people like that, is you can ask the question, why aren't there bumblebees the size of elephants? Why aren't there trees the size of skyscrapers, right? I mean, why do things just seem to have a kind of natural scaling principle that they follow? And it's because he kind of basically wants to argue, following metabolism and so on, that there are actually that nature entails scaling laws, like a law of nature is scaling. But key to the scaling laws is the fact that there aren't straight lines and smooth surfaces. So what he's warning about is that human inventions we have to choose to scale them. Like we have to discern the right scale. It's not natural. Whereas natural emerges to the right scale, we as humans have to figure it out. So it's interesting also, I guess, to think about alignment, like apathetic, like no line, and actually alignment being the ability to judge the proper scale in your life, or to judge when you should relinquish something, or how you should move with things, like to actually get really good at that discernment of the right proportion of something, or the right scale of something, or what you should hold on to. So I'm it's interesting to think of align that way, but I'll stop and throw it to Daniel. Daniel, I hope you're doing well on this fine day. Thank you for coming, sir.
Always good to be to see all of you. The theme's actually wonderful. It's really resonating with themes in life. Like the first thing with the alignment, it's something that is something curious about being a person, because, and I think psychoanalysis would speak about in the space of drive, that there's something excessive that we are prone to, and there can be various forms of it. But that leaning into that excessive activity produces alignment in our structure, and that's very odd. Like things that maybe like more gross examples, like trance dancing. How can that function as healing? That it's this excessive endeavor. For me, also long walks, very long walks. Like sometimes something postural works itself out, but that whole activity and that repetition is pushing past or not related to, Daniel, I think you used like the rational and the non-rational. Like there's something non-rational about the insistence and the repetition, but there's something about being human that kind of activity confers an alignment. It might sound like a wild association, but that's like Moses, when the Amalekites and the Israelites are warring, and he's got his arms up, and then they start to notice that when he has his arms up, the Israelites start winning, and when he has them down, they start losing. And then he eventually needs help keeping his arms up in prayer. And so like this image of this mountaintop intercessor who's in this excessive activity, too much even for himself, that he needs help holding his arms up. And it's producing, I don't know if alignment would be the phrasing there, but the reason why I mentioned that is because the theme of cities, and then, like the heavenly city language of Revelation, the idea that, I mean, wherever we want to draw the line of natural and then denaturalize, and it's always a very helpful concept to look into, because it's often hiding something not examined, the functioning of natural, like the appeal to something natural, something not naturalized. So this I feel like wrath fell on my head 2 weeks ago, as I've said for the third time tonight. Almost excusing myself. But it's a insane, and it kind of comes about in this communal aspect. Like, what are the prophets speaking about when they're speaking about wrath? It's like this thing that turns a lot of people off this very shallow view of like the Old Testament God. What are these wrathful and something? But maybe there's more to what they're saying. Maybe there's more there, and a point to kind of get into that might be this idea of wrath. And there's something. It's close linguistically to wrought, like you wrought. Steel is wrought, or to make it. And I think so. There's something like the implication of turning, pressing and turning, or the wine press of the Lord's wrath, like the crushing, the pressing. Then if you think at these layers of mediation, like individual, community, city, an individual repents, turns. How does a community turn? Or how does a city turn? And if God's wrath is applying at these mediated levels, such that the unrepentant, the unturning city gets pressed in a way that, like it's like some passages in Isaiah, it's just it's detailing the expression of God's wrath, and it's atrocity after atrocity. But every single one of those things is meted out from man onto man. So it's God and it's not God. It's man onto man, but it's God present, pushing on man through man. And the accusation is unrepentance and rebelliousness, or rebellion. So the prophet appeals to God's wrath, but there's like a secret in the wrath, in that it's because there's this ambiguity of fire, wine, pressing, crushing. So there's something like at the individual level. It's this curiosity of, somehow I find alignment, and I find aspects of my being by pressing, by this something excessive, or on the other side, like lacking, like fasting, by minimize. There's something about that that's uniquely human, that in that I find an alignment that is non-rational in a sense. It's not calculable according to the normal incentive structures that I'm calculating my investments in time and effort and the like. But I find alignment in that. I find that's really strange. Strange that happens. And then if you then place that individual who's finding that kind of alignment within a communal structure and their role in that, then what's the city's alignment? Like, what's the heavenly city? What do you mean when we I suppose we don't talk about it that much, but I'm wondering about what that is. So let me pause it back there. Cool.
No, outstanding. I think that, well, it's interesting as you're speaking. Everyone, thank you for coming, Mr. Jock and Clayton. Michelle had just had a conversation with Sari and Seeking Genuine on alignment and what is alignment, and something that I was mentioning is, it's funny how the word alignment, almost like apathetic, could it mean like not being in a line, and was also playing on the idea that following like West on laws of scaling laws of nature, one of the reasons why human creations don't have natural scaling laws, thus they can overfit and cause all kinds of pathology, whether it be pollution, size of city, et cetera, so forth, is because humans can uniquely make straight lines and smooth surfaces, where nature does not. And that goes a long way to making sure that bumblebees aren't the size of elephants and all these other dysfunctions, and why nature has this kind of scaling equilibrium, you could say. It naturally finds that makes the system optimal. So kind of a garden, or I'm thinking like a wilderness, as Satori has spoken on, has a kind of natural scaling. And it is interesting to think if there's something about virtue ethics and virtue that is actually tied to doing the work of judging proportionality in the absence of natural scaling laws, like actually judging the proportional amount of wrath versus grace versus right, because all of those topics like wrath versus grace, or any, patience versus passivity, pride versus magnanimity, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are kinds of judgments and discernments. And in a sense, they don't have quote unquote scaling laws. Like there isn't a point where pride will naturally back off from overextending into areas of your life where it shouldn't be. Or there's no point, let me put it this way, there's no point where magnanimity will not naturally pass over into pride problematically. Like it's very good to love great things, but then it passes over into I'm a great thing. Oh, well, now we have pride, right? And maybe you are great, but the moment you kind of examine it, then various problems can begin to manifest, right? So when sex passes over into lust, love, or something like that, right? So there's a way in which it's funny to think of virtue ethics as actually the work that humans have to do in a way, because there are not natural scaling laws. There's not natural proportionality as nature has. And it's then also funny to think, in that sense, the very special capacity of human beings in a certain sense is straight lines and is smooth surfaces, which if we think of rationality and technology and all of these things, yeah, they kind of reflect straight lines and smooth surfaces, of which then afford us the modern world, and they make possible New Jerusalem. Like you can't have New Jerusalem as a city. You have to have straight lines and smooth surfaces for it, but they also give you the pathologies, right? They also give you the problems. So learning to judge that power. So perhaps the knowledge of good and evil, as in a certain sense, is the knowledge of lines and smooth surfaces. But now we have to do the work of learning the virtue by which we can rightly proportion it, because that is not so given, right? And I guess the last thing I'm thinking, and then I'll throw it to Satori, and on what you said on wrath is actually really important. And the book I always go to is Exclusion and Embrace on Volkov Smil about that with God, and where he talks about it's really easy to be upset at the wrath of God when you yourself don't live in the midst of injustices and stuff like that, right? Like when you kind of have a comfortable life, it's like, oh, wrath is a terrible thing. Well, if you were being, if your family or, you were being tortured and all of that, you would actually see wrath as grace, right? So now more has to be said on that, because it's interesting to think, I guess, kind of tied to that, although I'll expand on it later. It's funny to think, what's the difference between alignment and what's the term? Like almost like straightness. And what I mean by that is straightness is like you're doing your 9 to 5, you're paying your bills, you're doing what you're supposed to do. But that's precisely actually why people don't feel aligned with something. Like they're doing the social script. They're keeping things straight in a certain way, and yet they don't feel aligned. And it's kind of like, well, with what? What do you not feel aligned with? They feel inauthentic, or they feel like they're repressing something. So it's interesting to think how alignment does not seem to be the same as getting your life straight or keeping the straight path, in the sense of and maybe there's a better word, I'm just kind of thinking of this, is in the sense of you're doing your career and all of those different things. So it's interesting to think there's a difference between alignment and I suppose straightness, and maybe there's a better term, which funny enough, then straightness seems to be the overfitting of the logic of straight lines and smoothness, which leads to the technological essence, which leads to the modern psyche, which leads to all of the various troubles that has. So it's interesting to think of if there's a certain difference. And then, of course, the problem can be is when people feel like, then what happens if you only have an understanding of straightness as alignment, then when somebody says, hey, I'm feeling off or something is wrong, then you give them advice or they start doing something to regain straightness, but that just has them participate more in the system or the machine. And that actually isn't alignment. So it's interesting to think of differences there. But let me pause and throw it to Mr. Satori, then Mr. de Klerk, and Mr. Jock. And Mr. Satori, I hope you're doing well today, sir.
Doing great. So Yeah, what Daniel was saying before really stuck out to me because I had been thinking about this kind of like this thing of Christianity really trying to take Nietzsche's critiques like completely seriously. And so that's where I kind of got to the thing of saying like, oh, man's own belief that he that equality with God is something for him to grasp. It is sort of the thing that God is affirming. I mean, that is what if you believe, that's the idea behind a concept like theosis. But the problem is through history is what, man decides that he should be equal with God before he understands very much at all about who God is. So he's always striving to fulfill a particular image of what he thinks divinity is, which historically often is very tyrannical. And this kind of gets into the interplay between men and women, because that the inequality of that, the rational versus the non-rational, mirrors the relationship between God and man. So the women are kind of the ones that like decide like who's doing the best job of amongst the men of grasping for equality with God. They reject the guys that are just that are the posers. So let's see where we go with this. Okay, so the big problem there, like and this is even like thinking like when you talk about something like rebellion, and if man is rebelling against God, like that is he's stuck with a rock and hard place. That's you can't God will end you. If you look at like Pharaoh was convinced that he was divine, and he took that conviction all the way to the grave. Like he wasn't going to admit that God was God. Because he was God. So why would he? So he really believed it. And that willingness to embrace death really is like that shows you like where you're really at. And it was interesting even to think about like how Nietzsche's seeing like, oh, if Darwin points to something like biological determinism, like humans cannot accept biological determinism. Either they accept that it's true, then they become nihilistic and life has no meaning, and they become impotent and don't want to reproduce. Or if they decide that they don't care, they cease to be human, because if they just accept biological determinism and then they've said biological determinism is God, I'm not going to fight against it. I'm going to accept it. So you get to be, part of the breeding stock, but that's the end of your sole purpose. So you either die with your belief that you that there is supposed to be something superior about being human, or you descend to the point of being an animal. And so but it's interesting because it's in that willingness to die. That's why the slave morality always wins, because it's like, yes, biological determinism is more powerful than me, but I'm going to try to prove it wrong by going extinct. And like, that's like the logical endpoint. I mean, it really is even like the anti-natalists that want to cease any life from even coming to the point of sentience is just because they want to prove that suffering is so bad that it would be better to have no existence at all, which is an incredibly hubristic thought to have. But the interesting thing, what I was thinking about that is that, when it comes to like this scaling things or whatever, it's like people need to put themselves towards something that is like so extreme and so audacious that, that it I guess goes beyond the rational. And I thought this was really interesting when I was just watching something about how the Roman Empire, the laws that they enacted to try to encourage marriage, when they passed a series of reforms that gave women more rights, and it made it much more. It was basically very similar to the situation we have now, where the wealthy people could afford marriage, but they could also afford to not be married, and there was more maybe hedonistic reasons to choose to avoid it. So that was a luxury that they had. But then for the lower classes, it was increasingly financially risky, because you were assuming a risk in taking a wife and trying to raise kids without as much guarantee of being able to afford it. Very much a similar situation we're going on today. And also that South Korea did the same experiment as Rome, basically trying to put laws, and they would make these incentives, and they would either give incentives to try to get people to get married, or strong disincentives for people that chose to remain single. But it had very little effect. The only people that kind of budged was the ones who were just kind of already on the bubble, and it was like, well, I was undecided, but now here's a good deal, so I might as well just go for it. And what I was thinking about it was, the problem with that system is that it's essentially, if you acquiesce, you are essentially denying your belief that you are equal or ought to be equal with God. You're accepting the state as God. You're accepting, and that it's just, I think it's probably like, you can look at all the circumstances and the incentives and things, but I think it comes down to that. It just, people are repelled by the idea because it was the state that needed people to get married. It wasn't about, this is good for you as a person. I mean, they could say benefits of why it is, but basically, the state wasn't willing to put its own life on the line until it eventually did collapse. It was living in fear. It was saying, if people don't keep getting married, our economy is going to collapse. Therefore, we need to do all this stuff. So then the state has all this power, but it's also showing fear. And so it's just really interesting how really it has to come down to, I would say, maybe you have to have not just in marriage, but marriage is the good example, but that it has to kind of have that grand romantic gesture of self-sacrifice, which you see like in Christ's, because essentially what Christ is doing is saying, I'm not going to be afraid of death, but I'm also not just going to die like for myself, but I'm dying for the other. And the reason why he's dying for the other is so that the other, which is us, can achieve the thing that we have grasped onto and hubristically demand, that we be made equal with God. So in some sense, it's like God is acquiescing to us as the subordinates to elevate us. So that's the gist of it.
That's fascinating on those points in the state that you were saying. Well, a few things come to mind. First off, and then I'll give it to Mr. DeClerc and Mr. Jock and Mr. Luber. Wonderful to see you. I certainly and everyone. Mr. Satori had a fantastic conversation with Ian recently that I really Insight Incorporated that I really enjoyed. It's very interesting to think, and we were talking a bit, Mr. Luber. Michelle brought up alignment. What is alignment? She had, again, it makes me think of theme. And she had a conversation with Sherry and Seeking Genuine about it. And I was thinking the interesting kind of idea of the difference between alignment and straightness 9 to 5, doing what you're supposed to do, and yet that may not be the same as alignment. So it's interesting to think those. And Mr. Satori, it is interesting to think is perhaps I do wonder if alignment is possible without some sort of quote unquote grand romantic gesture or something grand, right? It seems as if that's really important. And it is very interesting how, on your pointing out with South Korea, when the state tries to incentivize population, it's interesting because then having a child becomes an economic calculus. And the moment you do that and you see you're done, like the moment it's like the enfrainment in the Heideggerian sense, right? There is no like economic reason to have like you can, and that's why the moment you start thinking about children, even in terms of responsibility, economically viable or things like that, which it's, this is where it gets difficult because people say, well, there are real realities like that. Yes, But the issue is, the problem is, if you're trying to be rational about having a child, there's a certain degree in which it's an open-ended question. There's no way to know how much it will cost. There's no way to know everything you're going to do. And the moment that people become more conscious of thinking it that way, because of state incentives to get people to have children, paradoxically, the less likely they are to have children, as opposed to, well, God said it's to, to be fruitful and multiply. It's almost, there's more of just an imperative to do it. And it is interesting to think how it does seem to be the case that human beings need a healthy amount of things in their life that are outside of their control, that they think they will not be able to handle, precisely to rise to the occasion of being human. It is also interesting to think of, I have been thinking more and more of antinatalism, as you brought up. Like, the very fact antinatalism becomes plausible to a people means that people have failed. Like, if it's like, because the plausibility structure, like Mr. Rivera has been doing work on pragmatism and thinking, Richard Warden, I think this is correct. I do think neo-pragmatism is quite distinct from other forms of utilitarianism, so on and so forth. But there's something about also antinatalism could be evidence that if all you have is a vector of the good versus the beautiful, you're in trouble. Like, because antinatalism can kind of show ultimately the inadequacy of doing things because they're good, because they're like, well, they're suffering. And basically, without beauty as a leading principle, pointing to Mr. Jockin, who has a class coming up at Parallax that everyone needs to take, like, you need to take it. You need to freaking take it. He had a talk with Andrew Sweeney recently that was pure gold. It is interesting how perhaps an unintentional blessing and grace of antinatalism is precisely to help show the inadequacy of the good as the leading principle without the beautiful. Because there's a way in which the proper response to antinatalism has to be a kind of chuckle and smile. Like, that kind of knowledge that the saint has of the beautiful, where all of the reasons that the antinatalist is giving you to not exist or to go toward non-existence is precisely the stuff that makes sainthood possible, that makes the beautiful possible. But the very fact that antinatalism has gained such traction is evidence that we as a people have failed and need. We have failed the beautiful, and we need the beautiful. Otherwise, antinatalism becomes a very plausible sort of doctrine to people. And then also, I guess the last thing I'll say is perhaps a way to help with the topic of God's wrath is that I think it's important to know that the context of God's wrath is very often in the Bible seemingly against people who are trying to be like God, trying to replace God. And you see now the modern Westerner in a first world nation thinks about God's wrath because you told a lie or because you did a sin. And of course, sin and trying to be like God are similar, but one of the reasons why it's harder to understand God's wrath as having an important role is because we're not thinking of it in terms as a corrective against the tendency of humans to be like God. And that is also kind of a corrective against that. So when you see it that way, then it has a kind of a much more cosmic role. Now that has to be expanded on, but let me stop and give it to Mr. de Klerk and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. de Klerk, please.
Yeah, there's a lot here that I kind of want to pick up on. So I had a dialectic into dialogos discussion last night, and we were talking about trust, and particularly trust in the unknown. And kind of something that we ended up talking about is kind of what's primary to, like, it's not so much that you're trusting in the unknown, it's like you're trusting in a calling, and maybe that's similar to this feeling of alignment, like you're trusting in this mission or purpose or yeah, like, don't have great words for it, but like that's what you're putting your faith into, and that enables you to go into, like, the Joseph Campbell quote about the cave that you most fear holds your treasure, because we were kind of like trying to make this like bring the discernment to it of like there's infinite things that are unknown to us, right? And there's infinite things that we are scared of and that we fear, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we should go into all of those, right? Like we may actually be very ill-equipped to handle a certain cave that someone else may be, like that may be exactly where they must go into to discover themselves, to evolve their character. But another thing that we talked about was like, okay, like how do those callings come about? Like how does one um receive that, and how does one discern and follow that? And then we started talking about story, actually, and how this feeling of being in a story that, and a lot of people talk about like Jordan Peterson will talk about, like authoring your life and like self-authorship, like, writing your own story, like taking ownership of your life, like moving from that straightness that you were talking about, Daniel, where it's kind of like you are passively consuming a story that was kind of given to you that isn't necessarily yours. But that I think there's like a little bit of a tension between the self-authorship and also like kind of this almost like divine like transmission of a story that in some sense, it's like what you talk about, Daniel, like it's better to be chosen than to choose. Like in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, it's like Bilbo was chosen, like his story was in some sense given to him, but he also had agency to choose whether or not to go on it. And that's how a lot of people talk about finding God. It's like God doesn't force himself onto you. He doesn't force you to believe in him, but he makes his presence known, and it's like, and people who end up following God, they kind of say like, I don't really feel like I have a choice, but also like it's the choice that affords me the most choice. Um, and so I think there is like something to this alignment, like shifting from straightness to alignment that has to do with story. This sense that you are in an unfolding story, both individually and collectively. That I think is really important. To kind of pivot from that to like what you were talking about with the financial incentives to, encourage marriage and things like that. What I was thinking as Michael was talking there is like financial incentives don't help people fall in love, right? Like they don't help you meet the person that you're like meant to spend the rest of your life with and like learn how to like be in relationship with them. Like so it's like it's another like classic example of modern society not addressing the root cause of a problem and trying to address it like at the top level, right? Um, like the people that it probably helps the most are the people that want to get married and have kids, but like feel like they can't financially. Um, but even then, you see in like I was thinking also is like the marriage rate and the birth rate. I don't know the statistics, but I can imagine in rural lower class communities are higher than wealthier communities. And you can say like less because there's less, like sex education and less access to contraceptives and like, all of that stuff. And like, there's definitely something to be said about that. But also it's it's the cultural norm there, and it's it's like a chicken and egg thing. It's like, was it like close-knit communities that then made people feel like they wanted to have kids because it was like, oh, like there's something beautiful about this, or was it the inverse of that? But like I don't think the marriage and childbirth crisis is because it's just a financial issue. I think that's downstream from a lot of other, things, cultural breakdown, lack of trust in relationships, uh, like the wounds and the pains that come with heartbreak, especially early in life that a lot of people don't recover from, a whole lot of things. And I think story, like what we were talking about last night, is like story gives someone a sense that even if they don't know the next sentence or the next chapter of where that story is going, and even if, a lot of chapters of that story are maybe ones that they wouldn't want to have in the final draft if they were like polishing their life manuscript into a final draft, like it gives you the faith to know, like, and the momentum. There's like a momentum that comes with feeling like you're in an unfolding story that that like triumphs over the mental calculus of like, should I make this, like drawing out a pro and con list for every decision based on like pragmatic, practical reasons. There's like something kind of unexplainable about why you get pulled into certain things, because you're being drawn out of yourself into like some like larger narrative. And yeah, I think that's kind of where I'll leave it. But thank you.
No, a lot of the important topics, and I'll throw it to Mr. Jochen here. So a few things. First, it can be the case that your treasure is in the cave that you fear, because your treasure is courage, and courage opens your horizon of being home. And so, by definition, if the treasure is courage, then it has to be in the cave that you fear. And if courage is the virtue that enables all the other virtues, I think, as Lewis put it, that would make sense. There's also a few things also, too, Mr. Jochen and Mr. Luber and I were having a conversation the other evening, and obviously Mr. Luber is the master at story here. But something that I think about sometimes is that you have to have the story of your life feel like it chose you more than you created it. And that can kind of mean that your life starts with an experience of a miracle or revelation. Like you have to start with revelation, and then you find yourself in a kind of story. Like you start with a miracle. So really, there's something about living your life in a manner that increases the probability of a strike of beauty, of a revelation or an insight. I was speaking with Seth and Aspasia about revelation the other evening as a term, but this thing that strikes you, and you can indeed live your life in such a manner that increases the probability of this occurring. And it's interesting because it's as if in order to experience the way that you are living as something that chose you more than you chose it, because if you chose it, as Philip Reeve talks about, then there's an arbitrariness and it's existentially nervous, and it's probably going to be made in the image and likeness of the zeitgeist, which means you're just going to serve the socioeconomic system and think that it's the story of your life. So there's these all kind of ironies that occur. Like a story that you make for yourself could, if you're not careful, actually just be captured by some force over you without you even being aware of it. So there's something about the story that has to be striking. Something has to be appears, and this gets into the Calzer and Mr. Luber's work on thing. But it's interesting to think about the criticalness of this experience of being chosen. Now, this can very much get tied into the children topic, because there's a few things with that. One, on the idea that basically with rural people, that it said, it's like, well, yeah, poor people have a lot of kids. That's why they're poor. It's because they had a lot of kids, right? But there's an ideological need of that to be the answer. Because if you say, well, actually, they're poor and have a lot of kids, that would show that you can have a lot of kids and be poor. So they need it to be a cause and effect relationship, right? Because if it's not a cause and effect relationship, then that kind of changes the idea that there's a responsibility, that it's actually moral in a way, because that's what you kind of have in the modern world, right? That having fewer kids, like everyone is now, obviously with the Collins, Malcolm and Samoa, and many people who have become pronatal, I think what has to, on this idea of why are birth rates falling, there are many reasons for this. There's something about modern life, but we have to remember that it became an ethic. Having a lot of kids made you like irresponsible. That does a lot right there. It's not until now where people are starting to go, actually having kids is responsible. Well, the cat's out of the bag, And furthermore, you're saying it's responsible because it's going to save us all. And then but that's where the anti-natalists have got you now, because they're like, who cares? Give me an ethic. If all you have is efficiency, you can't answer the anti-natalist. You can't answer them because they're just like, why is it good for us to continue living? All I see is suffering, right? You have to have the beautiful, which then the very economic calculus that is now trying to increase birth rates, which actually was one of the reasons they went down as an ethic. It doesn't have the metaphysics to reverse course, because you need a metaphysics of beauty and you need a metaphysics of, dare I say, grandeur, or else why? Right? And actually it just seemed, oh, you're just being egotistical. You're going to bring all these children into the world to save your GDP? What a bunch of egotistical, self-centered people. You're going to save your GDP, to increase the workforce, to stop the economic catastrophe. You're going to have a bunch of kids. I thought we were supposed to treat humans as ends, not means. Like now, the entire saving the demographic crisis, when you listen to like nations talk about it, is completely treating children as we got to get labor. We need labor to pay for Social Security. So the anti-natalists are like, F you. No, we're not going to bring kids into this world in order to have labor. Let's go extinct, because that will give us a market equilibrium, won't it? So it's not going to. So right now, I'll stop. Right now, the discourse on stopping the demographic crisis without beauty is nonsense, because you're treating kids as a means to saving the economy and serving the older generation versus an end. And that's where you have to respond to the anti-natalist. And you basically can't unless you have beauty. Now that's a larger claim. Also, to the other key argument. So we were speaking last week about the mystery of Stiglitz, Robert Solow, all of these different people make a distinction between production and productivity. Okay, so production is basically GDP, labor, the amount you're able to produce. But productivity is your capacity for production. So productivity is creativity, right? So here's the question. What if having kids forces people to gain in capacities of productivity that they otherwise never would? So, because here's the irony then. If you say, okay, we shouldn't have kids until we have enough production to handle it, but actually the having of kids is what makes you more productive because you have to take care of them. Like there are so many things in life that when you have kids, you're like, you would have never done. That because you have kids, you force yourself to live up to the standard of, you become a more productive person, okay? You become someone that actually will solve problems and do things you wouldn't do. So the irony can be is that what a society may not realize is that having children went a long way to increasing productivity and actually making the average person more capable of generating productivity, where then if you say, well, you actually shouldn't have kids until you reach a certain level of production, well, then the very thing to reach that level of production is the productivity that you never get the forcing function of children to make, right? So that's a giant economic question, actually. And you see, and that's where when you bring it into an economic calculus and you start saying, well, we need to be careful about having kids until we have production, it is not clear if the point is this, that very way of thinking could be of what reduces the average person's productivity precisely to have the production to handle having kids. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, actually. And then, of course, the other argument I would make economically is that one of the reasons we're having stagnation and a fall of productivity, that's why living standards are going down, even though GDP is going up because it's just capital expenditure, is because the average person is not living their life in such a manner that brings about greater productivity, which is creativity, creative destruction, raising, because we've removed everything from the average person's life of which can give them an experience of feeling chosen. This is my point. The average person's productivity goes up to the degree they feel chosen. And by productivity, I'm not just talking about wage power. I'm talking about creativity, the ability, qualitative experience. It's a much fuller picture that we're talking about. I'm just using the economic term like Robert Solow. Like, let's say creativity. I like that. I was speaking about that last week. So we've removed creativity is tied to the feeling of feeling chosen. And the technological essence and quantification makes you live in such a way that removes from your life all the things that can make you feel chosen. Therefore, creativity goes down. Therefore, you do not have the economy to handle more children. Therefore, it's responsible not to have them. Therefore, you don't, when actually the having of them what might be precisely what makes the society more creative and engaging in more productivity so that it actually raises living standards. That the economic directionality of that question is often assumed. And that, I think, has made us foolish. And then also the reactionary making up for the demographic crisis, therefore is not able to provide a vision that will actually get it across the finish line, and they don't have a good response to the antinatalists, because ultimately you will need beauty. You will need something that can make you feel chosen. But let me stop, throw it to Mr. Jockin, who everyone take his class, take his freaking class at Parallax, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Satori. Mr. Jockin, I hope you're well today, sir.
Yeah, starting July 5th, take my course on Parallax, on beauty. Anyways, two major notes. I think the first thing is, so I'm looking forward to hearing this conversation Michelle had, because straightness and alignment is really interesting. It reminded me of God bless YouTube. It was a lecture on the history of machining. It was fantastic 20-minute lecture about it, of how we engineered precision. So some aspects I knew, like basically, interreplaceable parts, things like that. But the one that I want to bring up today, one aspect of it was how we actually produced smooth surfaces and straight edges. How did we do it? We did it by the rubbing against of three, not two. It wasn't one, it wasn't two. It was a minimum 3 large plates. And it's by which had variations of concave and convexity. And if you only did 2, the rubbing against friction of 2, it would not be perfectly straight. It took a minimum of 3. It was the material friction of the 3 plates that can get you a machined flat surface, which was the origin allowing for flat edges, right? Smoothness, flatness, hard at corners, things like that. I find that very interesting, that how we generated smoothness was via a material interaction of a portion and relation, via material friction. I think that's really interesting, mostly because from Aristotle, the discussion of abstraction is removal in thought, right? So when we're stripping away from matter, it's basically figure, geometric figure, schema. So, and that discussion, again, I'm looking forward to Michelle's discussion about it, but this idea that the problem is when we talk about, also Daniel, we're talking about this nature of virtue or in relationship to it, is when we deal with, when we don't have external friction, material necessity to abide and compel a relation, then yeah, it can go absolutely haywire because we're horrible at the infinity. That's the issue. We're beings in time of body, which are in relation to limit, but in the experience of mind, there is no limit. So as a result, we fall apart. I think that's actually a very good heuristic. And I say that, and actually I say this because another aspect of it is much of the modern world is an abstraction of dependency. So what I mean by, and actually the lecture video on the history of machining talked about this. It wasn't, actually it's also from Nassim Taleb, actually from Anti-Fragile. So it wasn't like people didn't know about wheels, right? In the past, in ancient Rome, right? Ancient Rome or Greek, they knew about wheels because they knew circles. They knew it. But why weren't they, why was the horse preferred over wheeled vehicles? Because you needed smooth roads. That's why. So we needed to, the activity of dependence, the relation of technology is actually this relation of dependencies versus independency. One can make an argument, pardon me for the kind of artistic riff here, that when God had his relationship with wrath was related to Tower of Babel, right? Anytime we wanted to deny or forget our dependencies, which is typically the issue of effectively a Gnostic denial of matter. We wanted to forget our dependencies because matter gives us an binding constraints. That's what it does. Aristotle has a comment of both hypothetic necessity, which is of definition and of the eidos, and then this material necessity, which gives us our matter and our constraints. So it's God's wrath is it's when we forget being, and specifically our dependencies. But the whole point is that we have an interesting relationship. So what are we to do? We don't want to use the language I would use, the algorithmic. No, because I like my Amazon deliveries. I like having roads that allow us to travel much more efficiently, right? But the reality is these are inherently more fragile instruments. like, because organ and instrument, even though our modern language, we separate them. And there's a fair distinction in the sense that organs typically are of entities that have internal motion versus artifacts or instruments that are artifacts that have external cause, right? The hammer versus your bladder, for example. But the subtle point is it's the relationship of dependencies too, is also at play here. What I mean by that is a car is inherently more fragile, like a wheeled vehicle car is fragile compared to a horse, for example. The fragility versus robustness point from Nissim Taleb. I think that's actually a way to draw that out. So what is that kind of straightness is actually through the interaction of friction, of multiple interactions with each other. That's what creates straightness actually. And actually it's kind of almost the mean revealing from the interactions. One can make an argument that actually the process of the contest of Elenchus, of discourse, is also to do that too, but with ideas, right? So when Socrates is having people test the definitions to get to the form, the definitional form, it's because we want to put friction on the concept. We want to put friction. So we put that friction to it, and by pressing against, smoothing out between them, we can get to a clarity, almost a straightness with clarity definite kind of point. You can kind of draw on that. And when we see alignment is when there's, I want to use this idea of synchronicity, the alignment of this matter with this material in this context to achieve this activity. We kind of riff on these points. I find that very interesting. So virtue is not only just about the relationship of in the space of abstraction away from matter, how do we abide in it without being destroyed? But more particularly, how do we return back to matter? So this is actually why I think it's, I'm in a discussion with some other individuals about some Proclus about commentary on Parmenides, and particularly what is the nature of matter? Is matter number, or is it something like stroge, what I've been talking about? Because both of them are that number and stroge is about the relationship to being to otherness. And actually that answer to that makes a very big difference. Number is indifferent, right? It has a kind of sense of indifference to it. But stroge has a very idea of there is very much a care, which also I think we even know that intuitively by just saying like, what's the matter with you? Why does this matter? Why do we have that language? It's almost like the preface is, why do you care? Well, obviously, what is the matter with you kind of points a wrongness, like what's wrong with you? There's on that end, but why does this matter? As a sense of demand of care. Why are we caring about this? I'm chewing on that. And I say that because the last note is this idea of children. We have to remember for a long time, children was considered as almost an indifferent thing. Famously, Socrates, when he's being put to death and he's being asked, what about your kids? Oh, don't worry. There'll be many people that take care of them. Like it's straight up indifference. Like we have to be honest. Like there is I do think, especially with contraception, and again, these technologies intervening on nature, it took something that was up the state of, quite frankly, indifference. It just happened because it was no longer an object of intention. Now it is. Like now it's a choice. Now the decision has to be made versus being a natural consequence of these things occur, these activities occur, this will happen. So that's already this, and naturally, I want to bring this point. Is children a matter of numbers, which is inherently of the indifferent quantification of min-maxing for some kind of indifferent objective, or is it a consideration of stroge, of love, of the beautiful, right? Things like that. And actually, the last note about that is, to be fair, kind of to move this back to the original point about matter as external as a constraint, as limit encounter. For a lot of people, children, like when Daniel made that comment, you would do things for your children you never do for yourself. It is like, I don't remember where I've read it, but I have many commentaries that for a lot of men, they don't get their lives together until they have children, because they don't have an external constraint to force them, to compel them into a certain, quite frankly, pro-social, productive, stable relationship until they have children. Now, obviously, there's always the example of men who disavow that, but that's kind of the point now, isn't it? That in the encounter of the beautiful, you can always choose to engage in it or disavow it. Look at that. That's actually an example of it. But that's usually the case, that usually children is an external principle, external limit imposed on people. But then if the rhetoric is of freedom, children deny your freedom, right? Because they put a constraint on you. So I think, again, one more time, here we go, that tension. What is the nature of our relationship to potential and limit becomes revealed to here? Because typically with men of virtue, they have an internal abiding principle inside them that guide them. They don't need an external law because they have the law abiding in them. I find that tension also very interesting. The last thing about it is that I had a note in here of of what I call the cryal image, meaning that relationship of matter and eidos found in the encounter of the morphic individual. There is that kind of symmetrical relationship, right? Mirrored image, better said, right? There's otherness and similarity in that relationship of abiding of material necessity and hypothetic necessity that come abiding together in the morphic individual body that is really is kind of where everything comes together. And I find that image of it, the idea of straightness and smoothness and the intelligibility of the algorithmic, the operations of it, abiding in a larger geopitic relationship, right? So because the thing, we get new access and new actualities of our activity of calculation and abstraction. That's the key. It gives us access to new potentialities, new activities that were not possible otherwise. But with an interesting twist of a kind of interlink of dependency and independency, as an example with the smooth road, for example, for transportation. That's all I have for now.
Magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. I'll give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Satori. And if anyone else has anything to say on this evening, I do have chairs to unfold at the venue, but we have plenty of time. It is very, it's interesting, as you're mentioning Stroge, there is something for me about the fact that there are scaling laws in nature that suggest something Stroge, as I understand it, Stroge, about matter. And as you've spoken about how there's something about the relationship between matter and form that seems to be Stroge, where matter kind of meets form. There's a way in which the very fact that things seem to naturally scale in nature in a way that is proportional, because there's something about love and friendship that makes space for, right? Like, you don't love something if you dominate, right? Like, if you kind of take over, right? Like, love has a certain, like, making space for, stopping yourself so that you can meet the other. So it is interesting to think if scaling laws actually in nature kind of in of itself is a bit of evidence that matter has a Stroge character to it. Whereas human beings, we have to choose that. Like, it is the scaling laws are not given. That's part of what actually it is kind of to be the shepherds of being. Like, is actually we have to bring Stroge to life, as opposed, and nature is a testament to Stroge and scaling going together. And of course, we have distinctions between scaling and spread, which are important. But there's something there that I was thinking about as you were speaking. And indeed, I'll have to watch on the history of precision. That's fascinating. I think also what you're saying about necessity. Yeah, there's something about the word alignment, which with this weird play of align, like apathetic, not align, alignment. That means it is the straightness that comes from friction. Whereas if you go straight to straightness, then you get pathologies, right? And that's actually, again, there are scaling, like if you go straight to straightness without alignment, you overfit, you get too large, you don't scale naturally, your ego grows too big, you destroy your relationships and stuff like that. So it is very interesting to think about alignment having this fundamental friction that is part of it. I think also what you're saying about necessity, yeah, as you remove, and I like also what you were saying about the roads and the smoothness and how it's all dependency. I think that's really, really important. It is also very and also, like you were saying, God's wrath being tied to a denial of dependency. I think that's very well put. So it's interesting, like the phrase "like God" is a really interesting phrase, because if humans are like God, that means that's dependency. We're only like God. Wrath is when you go equal to God. We are God, right? So if you say we're like God, then it's a dependent relationship, because you need God to be like him, and you need God for the standard of likeness. So it's interesting how the word like could be a term of dependency or equality. And it's almost as if God's wrath comes in when the word like functions as an equal sign, as opposed to a testament of dependency, as a testament to there being something greater than man. I think ultimately what you're pointing out with contraceptions and birth, et cetera, so forth, basically for me, anything you make a choice, you will destroy without a metaphysics of beauty. Like, if you make birth, having kids, a choice, but you only have the metaphysics of the good, then don't be surprised if people don't have children. Like, whatever to increase choice can open up possibilities of beauty. That's always the double move, right? Because when people are having kids and it's a necessity, that you're right, it can make it a certain sort of who cares. And furthermore, people can have kids that are not ready for it because they're not, and that can lead to all sorts of trouble. So you say, oh, we'll deal with that by giving people control over having children, which seems like the proper response. But the issue is, if you, wherever you create choice, you also create arbitrariness, and you also create existential stagnation if you don't bring with it beauty. And that's the issue, is the modern world is defined. You could say our age is defined as the expansion of choice before the doctrine of beauty, or a recovery of beauty, as we talk about. And that's the liminal space we're in. We've unleashed choice upon the world, and we are waiting for the beautiful, and we don't have it yet. And that's what we're trying to recover now. And until you recover that, then everywhere you've increased choice will be destroyed. Because there's no possibility for choice to make way for chosenness if you're only going to be thinking in terms of pragmatism, utility, et cetera, so forth. So we've really, like, our age is defined by a great challenge. We've chosen the direction of increasing choice and increasing freedom, but now we have to do the work of increasing beauty. And how do you do that and it not just be in the image and likeness of your ideology? Much more to be said, but I will stop and give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Satori. Mr. Luber, thank you for being here, sir.
Glad to be here. So, I mean, I was talking with Jock and Javier the other day about this. And I think an important aspect here is the more freedom, what that causes is the emphasis on the tool versus the agent. So, like, we historically would put number first because we want to survive, and we want to be able to predict things, and we want to be able to not get screwed by nature, essentially. And I think we're at a point where the reason why we'd rather put more attention on crafting our tools to make us safer, essentially. And children, and we don't emphasize the children component because it makes us, the more we don't throw ourselves in the tools, the more anxiety we develop that we're going to essentially be not safe, or we're going to have a bad outcome in our lives. You know, it's like, you hear all the time, it's like, oh, you better really get to know AI, get to know how to use AI. You don't want to get left behind. Like, there's that notion in the air of the tools is what will save us. So the children in that respect don't really help with that. It's almost like an impedance. And not saying like people are thinking in a dichotomy of like it's either children or a focus on technology, but the point being is maybe a little bit, but I think the point being is children on their own don't necessarily make someone think that they're safer. Technology explicitly makes us like feel safer, feel like we're in the right, feel like we're doing the right things, so to speak. The issue with that is the more energy we put into our tools and the less into basically ourselves, the more we will become a tool and not whatever we were prior to focusing so much on a tool. That's kind of how that story goes, essentially, you know, like the AI revealing itself as like the causer, it very well could be a response of just, let's focus more on the AI, focus more on the tools as the response to that. So it's basically it's either become more human or become, I guess, part of the singularity of technology. And I think it's very reasonable for someone to think to become part of the singularity of technology. The issue is, especially like in intellectual spaces, the whole transhumanism thing. It's are the people that are thinking, okay, let's go on the side of beauty, let's go on the side of becoming more human. Are we reducing the boundaries, conditions, if you will, of what makes a human being? Is that reductive? Like from a humanist perspective, where it's like, oh yeah, we're going to become basically more than human, different than human with technology, where it's like, well, that's actually just like another dimension of the human being that we just haven't fully realized yet. And the people that aren't embracing that are reducing what the human being can be, right? So I think the point that I'm saying is, not only is the question, how do we understand what the human being is in that kind of space when you're dealing with like the intellectual transhumanist, it's also because there's this mysterious component of what the capacity of the human being is, basically how to demarcate what a human being is in general. Because I think the second you demarcate what a human being is, you get rid of the mystery. And if you don't demarcate what the human being is, you get that intellectual transhuman side where it's like, human being could be anything, like we could become anything, which obviously is like nothing in a certain sense. So I just see, the question is how to deal with demarcation when it comes to what it means to be a human being. And that right there is a story. That is the question to me of story, in the sense of what a human being is essentially what story we want to tell. The demarcation itself would be the story we want to tell, essentially. Now, I think it gets complicated with the way I view story, in the sense of what story we want to tell. How do we come to understand that theme? And ironically, if we're telling a story where we become not human, like in the transhumanistic way, the problem that I'm having right now, I'm just thinking out loud, is just, it could be viewed as a comedy or tragedy. It really could be. It could be, oh, it's like tragic in a sense that it's like what we thought is a human, it really isn't a human, and it's like dying. But it also could seem comedic, and like to Jockin's point to our conversation, when you get to this level of like death and a real demarcation of things, right? It doesn't seem like comedy and tragedy are applicable within the container of that experience, that story, that life, what a human is, essentially, right? Um, so what happens once you enter, like, what is a demarcation? The contrasting positions aren't really like comedy, tragedy, or any kind of notion of vector of good, which would be like any kind of definition, really, any kind of definition. So the contrasting positions then at that point would be beauty and shame. And I think in that sense, it's like, if you're a transhumanist, how do you see it not coming from shame, in a certain sense? Because you're basically saying the capacities in which the human being is operating under currently isn't really operating in full capacity. So in that sense, it's like, it's shameful. You should be shameful of that. You're not fully realizing yourself and you're aware of that, right? That is shame, right? I mean, shame's a little tricky. But yeah, and then I think that's a really good way of looking at demarcating your whatever notion you think the human being is, because it really shows how you're supposed to feel about the movement of your notion. Like that's what the beauty and shame, feeling does. Like there's a show called Farron where Javier sent this video about it. I love the show. I think she's an example of like what a beautiful character is in a story, actually. And the video was saying, which I agree with, it feels like you're watching like, British Bake Off. Like it feels like there's like this cozy, warm feeling when you're watching. And that is a purely mood, emotional,
You were talking
Okay.
about British Bake Off. You said British Bake Off and it went off, and I was on bated breath. I'm like, British Bake Off? Heck yeah.
Basically, that it's like a British Bake Off in the sense of the feeling that the notion of that story, what it gives you, how it is, the expression of that story, who the main character is. It feels warm, cozy, like a British Bake Off. Like I really do think, as crude as it might sound, how you feel from someone's notion of what a human being is matters, and it actually is an indicator, like from a storytelling standpoint, right? Like if you have all these different philosophies, all these different notions of what a human being is, and you hear all them, and they all have their own logic that's coherent, they all have their own aim that makes sense. Like from my perspective, I just go through them and I'm like, how is this in a very pragmatic way useful to me? Like how does this help me? And in part of that evaluation, the first thing is how it makes me feel. Like that's for everybody. When you're reading something like, this doesn't feel right. Let me reread that. Like before you even have a rebuttal, like you get this feeling, right? Like that, like a storyteller in the respect of like philosophy like this and trying to like understand what it means to be a human being, very much is focused on like how you feel as you are experiencing the unfolding of any notion, any experience, any kind of demarcation, if you will. So those are some thoughts. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, all that's super important. So first off, yes, there's an intuition, if you will, like Bergson, all these different kinds. There's an intuition that leads rationality, and basically, also when you're dealing with the problem of internally consistent systems, you can't have rationality be what decides. It has to be something non-rational. Critically, all rationality actually requires and starts on something non-rational. When we emphasize the non-rational, it's reclaiming and acknowledging the thing that made the rational possible. That's why it's the only way to overcome Nash equilibria, because what you're actually doing when you deny the non-rational is you're actually denying the very thing that makes rationality possible, that gets it started, right? Like you think about something because of how it makes you feel or because it breaks. There's something beyond thought that makes thought go that way, right? But then what happens is thought denies, in order to give itself authority or different reasons, it denies that something else is what got it going. And that's when you get all of the different pathologies, because then you don't become good or learn or skilled in the thing that gets rationality going. So then it gets captured or it gets a life of its own or all these other things, right? So that's extremely important. On the AI stuff. Well, actually, first, I also want to say what you were saying about kids. There is this kind of thing in the air that tools will save us, and it's kind of like, how do kids fit into that? That's exactly right. It's not clear. There's an idea of how do kids fit into the story of technology of the Washington consensus. How does it fit in? And you see, what happened is for a long time, it was actually the whole idea of having less kids as responsible was tied to increasing productivity, because then both parents could work. The mom and dad could work. You could have more productivity. But then it was like, oh, crap, we didn't know it'd go so far that the birth rates would fall. So now you're trying to make up for it, but you're still under a metaphysic that can't address the issue. And in that way, the anti-natalist has got you. Also, there's something to be said that there's a way in which technology without eventually having beauty always becomes a kind of hell. Technology with beauty becomes New Jerusalem, if we use that language. So the problem is, like, technology ultimately, if it doesn't converge on beauty, is going to end up actually in something very problematic and autocannibalistic and devouring itself. And I think it points to what you were saying about transhumanism almost necessarily having a kind of shame to it. Like, technology that doesn't have beauty is going to kind of fall into a technology against limitation, against demarcation, which has to say that demarcation is a shame. A way I kind of think about it when you talk about shame versus beauty is, you know, it's like when people say, oh, that's a shame. You know, because there's a strong kind of shame, which is covering your head, you know, scarlet letter kind of shame. But then there's a kind of, man, that's a shame that we can't fly because we don't have wings. That's a shame that we can't do that because we don't have time, right? There's a kind of feeling of a regret, like that's too bad, right? Transhumanism has to have a certain motivation of that's too bad. It's too bad that we actually are limited in X, Y, or Z way. It's too bad that we're limited this way. Therefore, suggesting that overcoming limitation is the point. Like, there is an inherent good in overcoming limitation. And you see this all ultimately, yeah. I mean, we're at the AI Calzer. Like, this moment in history is kind of the giant movement of rationality. It is the entire movement of rationality being birthed at the E.O. Wilson friggin' campfire, moving through Mary Douglas, coming up with authoritative categories and abstractions so we can have society, moving into the logic of capital, moving to AI, and its giant basically kind of movement toward dream equality, which is where thought wants to be free of limitation, just like dreams are, that is being realized in AI. This is kind of the realization of that movement through history of thought. And we're now at the AI Calzer, which is the final absolute choice. And the final absolute choice is lack is not nothing or lack is nothing. If you say lack is nothing, what you are saying is that their limitation is not good. Because if you say limit matters, then you are saying lack is not nothing. Lack is a limit. There's always a limit. And I'm kind of conflating demarcation and limit here. And if there's distinctions, I think that's fair. Okay. Lack means there's a limit. And if you say lack is not nothing, you are saying you need limit. But here's the issue. It's axiomatic. That's the issue. It is the choice of which determines the scene. That's why it doesn't seem to fit into the comedy tragedy thing, is because you have to make a choice to kind of set the stage before the stage is there. And so the question is, what is the stage upon which comedy and tragedy are defined? Is it the stage of overcoming limit? Like, limit is the thing we want to get rid of? Or is it on the stage of tearing with limit and finding freedom in limitation? Because we believe that actually lack is not nothing, therefore limit is necessary for human development. We're at the point where we have to choose. Like, it's literally a choice. Like, and the weird and the problem. So what we've been saying, so there's something about the development and movement and growth of choice that actually leads you to the final absolute choice. And we have been saying that choice without necessity, and I would say beauty, destroys you. So here is the question. This is what you have to decide and then I'll throw it to Mr. Satori. At the final absolute choice, you have to decide this. Do you think freedom from limit creates beauty? Or do you think freedom in and before limit creates beauty? In a sense, this is kind of the ultimate theological question. Like, this is the theological question. Do you believe the world is more beautiful because God exists in a sense, or if God doesn't exist in a certain sense? Because if you say because God is a limit, is ultimately a kind of limitation principle, right? So then the question becomes, well, how do I even go about deciding that? Because that seems axiomatic, because if I choose limit creates beauty, then I carry myself in a world that would act and thus make it thus. Or if I believe limit inhibits beauty, then you carry yourself in a world, right? It becomes the kind of principle of orientation. And so look back on your life. Look back on your life. Because it does seem to me as if humans do not flourish unless there's the possibility of something surprising them, unless there's the possibility of encountering something, unless there's a possibility of something occurring that feels external from the human being. But that means there must be a limit. That means there has to be a limit. And again, this seems to also be warranted by the very fact that the entire political economy question, as we talked about a while ago, Kirk and Hayek and Rothbard basically was the realization that without limitation, the political order devours itself. Psychoanalysis seems to show us that without limitation, the human psyche devours itself. Men and women seem to show that without limitation, they destroy themselves. Children seem to show us without limitation, they destroy themselves. It is hard to find a single area in human existence where there is not evidence that a loss of limit equals pathology. If that is the case, this would provide not certainty, but at least significant reason to believe that the final absolute choice should be on the side of limit, choosing limit, acknowledging limit, not overcoming limit. But the problem is, since the movement of autonomous rationality parasitically through the human being is toward dream equality, it is toward actually overcoming limit, there's a way in which we have to fight ourselves in the very way our brains work to not go in the direction that the mind would naturally go in, which is the overcoming of limit, which is to equal God, not be like God. To identify with limit is to have likeness with God, therefore dependent. You are dependent on limit. Do you believe you're dependent on limit or not? That's like, do you believe in dependency? If you don't believe in limit, you don't believe in dependency. And therefore, you're equal to God. And therefore, dream rationality as basically, if you are, to be equal with God means reality is the equivalent of a dream. It has the characteristics of a dream. Of a lucid dream. You can do whatever you want. You see a car in front of you that you could lift your hand and make it fly. Like, determinations are not binding in a dream. That's the point, right? Like, determinations are simply expression of that which is not binding. So even if there's distinction in a dream, it is not actually other. That's the key to a dream. A dream is where distinction is not actually other. It looks other, it seems other, but it's not other. In a dream, it's all you. Rationality has a subconscious directionality toward making determination like determination in a dream, where it is simply seemingly other, but not, meaning you have complete control. That's what rationality, because my proof of this, as we've talked about, is the very fact that when you fall asleep, and therefore are not bound by the external world, what does rationality do? It whirls. It creates a world. It creates a dream. It creates an expression. It doesn't make a point, an algebraic point. It makes an entire world. Dreaming shows you what rationality is, what your mind is always doing when left to its own devices. So when you're awake and you're encountering determination, you're still using your mind, of which when left to its own devices forms a dream. And so that is part of the subconscious, and that's why the subconscious and dreaming and Freud and all of these things go together, because you're fighting a mind of which is naturally toward making every determination not actually other, and therefore what seems to be a limit, not a limit. And that is just fully realized in transhumanism. That is just fully realized in actually the dream of the transhumanist. And so given that it seems to be the case in all of these areas of life where the removal of limit leads to pathology, there'd be reason to think that that's not the way. There's more to say, but let me stop and throw it to Mr. Satori and then Mr. Joachim. Mr. Satori, please.
Yeah, so that it's very interesting, that problem of the freedom in limit or freedom from limits, and the question of equality with God. In the Christian story, because of the incarnation, you have God accepting the limit that we were already constrained by, so that our desire to be equal is actually justified. Like, that's what he, in a sense, came to redeem. But it requires us to have the correct conception of who God is and what it means. What it means to be equal to God is very dependent on what you think God is. And so now, but the story about like what it means to be human is really the same thing, because if like Mr. Joachim was talking about, the indifference that the Greeks had toward their children was very much rooted in a particular view of divinity, where they were looking at those Homeric mythological gods who are basically just powerful humans behaving badly. And if that's what you think divinity is, then you are going to, to be constrained to the needs of a dependent creature was very undivine in their view. But but when, and then but then the same thing, the other thing that occurs is that when people project that image of like what it means to be God or what it means to be human, and then create distinction by forcing a distinction or a limit on somebody else, basically imposing some kind of hierarchy, then that's, when that shame feeling comes in because you've been made to feel less than human. So either way, it's whether being human is at the top or being God is at the top. God and humanity are equal, I guess, in the Christian consensus anyway. Transhumanism is then another attempt to reinsert that prior message where you're creating a distinction among humans, where you want to make and it's maybe, it is based on some of the lack, but it's, it's interesting because that striving is very much part of the way that God seems to work through history if we have the aim in the right place. Because, there's many people that would have just said, just accept the limits of, you get such and such disease. That's the will of God. You're going to die, but there's no cure for that disease. And then it's the person that doesn't accept that and finds the cure. So we're always navigating that. Okay. Well, I wanted to go. Oh, there was something I wanted to say way back when Michael was talking about the thing with stories, because and I think this is a big part of it, because the stories that we tell about what it means to be human, what it means to be God, what we're striving for, they're all very much connected to that. Because I was thinking about it, and he was talking about getting married and falling in love, and I do think really that we need better stories in that regard. Because I was thinking about when I always wanted to get married, and there was a part of me were thinking that if I thought very much about like what would be great about being married is that to secure a woman would validate my ego. It would prove that I am a man of substance. And this is also essentially there was a circularity like in the ancient world of the proof of like if you're some powerful king and you say that you're God, that will get you women. And then what's the proof? Why do people believe it? Because you have women. That's why the other men will follow you, because you've proven your divinity by getting women. So it's kind of circular. But then there was a period of time where I prayed and I accepted the limit. Perhaps God does not want me to be married. If the case, if that's a limit that He's chosen for me, then to fight against that would be wrong. But then eventually, He had said that is not what you want. But then my approach with actually getting married was that not nearly so much about what this does for me, but more so, here is a person who I can actually help in their journey to becoming something more, to overcoming limits, someone who I can serve. And that is ultimately a more fulfilling story because, so here's the next thing. This person who I'm 100% certain that God chose for me is not someone who validates my ego in lots of ways, is not someone who makes me feel like I've already arrived, but is someone who very much causes me to have to look at where I am and strive towards divinity in some sense, to be more like Christ, but also in all the areas of achieving more, earning more, providing, being a better husband. So, and because of that friction, that friction is straightening me out, I guess you could say. So to kind of go to that machining thing. And then what I wanted to mention about that whole machining thing, I was thinking about this because that friction will produce a tool with a straight edge, so even as just came from working, and all the tools that I have, they have been ground to some level of precision where their straightness, their flatness is consistent and can be used as a standard to measure other things against. And with a tool, I can take the tool where it needs to go, and I can apply it however it is. So I'm flexible in that regard, but I can take its rigidity and apply it where needed. But this is what I was thinking about. There are other ways to come to that level of precision, ancient ones that they knew. So like the first one is, if you want to get a straight line, like on a wall, you use a plumb line, which is just a string and a weight. But it only is straight when it has a fixed position. So you have to secure it. It's dependent on a fixed point, and then it will hang straight, and you can determine what's straight because it's got that rigid anchor. And then the other one is like if you need something that's level, water will sit level in a container, but it has to have a rigid container to sit in. A river is not flat, but if you fill up a pool and there's no wind or whatever, then the water will be level. So you can measure something level with that. And that gives you all that, like Archimedes in the bathtub, because you can compare the lines, you can measure the displacement. So it gives you a very accurate level of precision. And what I was thinking about that one especially is the way that they make glass now. So most of the time they use that liquid principle. Glass is liquid, but and so usually to get a flat sheet of glass, you have to have liquid glass, and then put it against something flat, and that'll give you somewhat of a result. But because making something rigid flat is a difficult process requiring all the machining, the way they actually figured out how to do it with the best results is that they float liquid glass onto a running a river, essentially, of molten metal, and the metal is hotter than the glass, or whatever. The glass floats on top, so that's how it gets perfectly flat. And so they're saying about like, there's something about like how instead of like the friction that heats it up, at a certain point it gets that metal to relax, and then it relaxes into a perfect alignment of straightness. So I don't know, there's some sort of a Sabbath principle there with relaxing into things. But but the stories that we tell about that, really I think has a big part to it too. What we're aiming for, where we're going to apply those points of friction or the points of release or whatever. It does. The story is the thing that kind of guides us there.
That's fantastic on the glass making. I am now thinking of alignment. What is glass making? What is liquid? Maybe what is glass making to alignment is what maybe hammering metal is to straightness. So it is interesting if there's something there with that, because I didn't know that about glass. That's completely fascinating. I'm also thinking about what you were saying with pagan gods and different things. There is something about if you have gods that are not also creators or the creators, there's a way in which you get gods that don't have skin in the game, and that becomes very problematic. Perhaps something critical with the Abrahamic religions is that you get a god who's also the creator. And I don't remember exactly all of the details of Greek and Roman gods, but there are demigods, there are different god. There is obviously creator beings, but they're not necessarily. There are possibly gods of whom are not creators, and I think that is very important because if you're all powerful and you create, that puts a limit on you because you have skin in the game. And even if I guess you could do some, let's say God creates. Because once God creates, it's skin on the game. Because I guess if God creates and then uncreates, it's still not possible for God to not know he created. Like, and then that's like an imperfection in God. I guess God could maybe like brainwash himself or something, but then if he brainwashes himself, that's kind of weird. So there's something about once God creates, that creates a kind of skin in the game. Like that demands something of God, but it's something that God chose. So it's not a limit on God, it's a chosen limit. And that to me starts getting at the crux. Human beings seem to, like God in this sense, require a chosen limit. We seem, and that's where the expansion of choice in modernity is not a mistake. It is actually a very important development, but it is now in that Hegelian way leading to the contradiction, which is choice destroys you without beauty. And we got to figure out how to have beauty, and we don't know, because here's the problem. If you choose the beautiful, that destroys it. So choice needs beauty, but if it chooses it directly, that's not beauty. And this starts to get at the key kind of tension and contradiction we have to think today, that I think gets back to Mr. Luber's question on like, what is the human being? Like what is the human in this weird sense? And so there's a way to put it is, it seems as if like humans like need limit, but if you set the limit, then it's not a limit. And I think this also gets to what you were saying, Mr. Satoy, on this idea that most people's experience of limits are arbitrary, or something that the powerful chose to oppress. So it then makes sense that transhumanism would arise as an overcoming of limit. And also it would make sense that we associate overcoming limit with the good, because it is good. That's the issue. Like, overcoming limits are good. But then there's a point in which the good overfits into the beautiful, and there's some kind of limit that is different from other limits that we mostly experience in life, that actually affords the possibility of the beautiful. Like the limit of God per se is different from the Foucaultian norm. It's different from the limits set on you by the IRS. It's different from the limits put onto you by the powerful, right? Like when God as limit, which is also interesting, because there's almost a way in which it's not so much God sets limit, but God as limit. And then, I mean, there is law in different things, but all of those are part of God's asness in this certain sense. They're laws that are alignment with God. They're not just arbitrary. It's actually for the sake of relationship in a certain way. That all then means the limit is not arbitrary. And so the issue is, here's the problem, is human beings need limit that they don't choose. In order for there to be a limit that chooses them, and then that puts them in the place to choose that chosenness, which there's a bunch of different layers to that, because we have to choose our chosenness, right? That's kind of the Frodo thing that Mr. de Klerk was getting at. Like, you have to choose that very characteristic of chosenness. And I think and then again, if we look at psychoanalysis, economics, politics, all these different things, it's all running into this problem. Human beings need limits, but if humans set limits, it's power and oppressive. But how do you have a limit that someone doesn't set? And the problem is, if we also assert a limit, then that destroys pluralism. That's putting it over other people. Like, people all have to set their own limits, but then the limits that some people set or they conflict with others. Like, every religion is a boundary condition of various limits, and that leads to a lot of trouble. So what ends up happening is there seems to be, like, it also goes, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, on this question of how do humans demarcate? Like, how do humans limit? There's something in which it would seem to be that the demarcation that humans need must be revealed to them more so. Like, it must be something that they encounter. Like, we cannot demarcate ourselves. But how do you encounter limit? How is it unveiled to you? Right? Well, I think in the beautiful it does. And then what it is the human is meant to be a being of whom lives in such a manner that increases the conditions of possibility for demarcation to be unveiled to them via revelation, or it is something that is, and then they choose if they live according to that chosenness, which doesn't seem to make sense or feel like a real choice unless you realize it's dependent on memory. Memory in this way is where freedom then comes out, because you can forget. And the way you choose chosenness and actually have real freedom there, and it not be arbitrary, is because of memory. Because you can forget, you can not have the virtue to maintain memory. And that's where, like, because there's a way in which if you choose your chosenness, that just sounds cute. that doesn't sound like it's actually an expression of agency. But I mean, goodness, I think so much of life is just not forgetting stuff. Like you forget, you've had these strikes of beauty, you know better, and you forget. Like you've been chosen, and you've been chosen by these things, or you've had these things revealed to you, and you forget. And then, of course, the theme of of many religious traditions is don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. The reason you're going to church every week is because you forget stuff. It's not that you don't know, it's you forget. And so memory kind of fills in the space between chosen and choosing, so that you have a limit that is a real limit on the human being, but it is not oppressive. So memory becomes huge in all of this. I definitely experienced that. Like I definitely experienced personally, and then I'll throw it to Mr. There's too many sticky notes and too many chairs to unfold. But I definitely personally experienced life as way in the business of not forgetting things I've had revealed to me, or they feel like they've been revealed to me. Like it's forgetting things because you're moving too fast. You're too nervous. You're giving into anxiety. It is clouding. You're becoming tunneled. There's this tunneling that happens in the mind where you know better, but you tunnel. And definitely, almost sometimes, the problem is it is forgetting, and it's not forgetting. It's tunneling. It's a kind of like everything narrows, and you lose sight of the broader picture. And the forgetting is in this tunneling that happens because you're overwhelmed by the bills or something. So there's something about memory that affords the possibility of agency in the relationship between the chosenness and choosing, limit and an agency. There's something about memory that is massive in all of this. But I will stop and I will throw it to Mr. Jockett. Mr. Jockett, please.
Great conversation. I think this note about the dream is the lack of determination, and distinction is not other in dreams. And I'm just thinking about the notes of quickness to wit, awakening, and what's called cleverness. So in Greek, there's a very clear, imagine the modern word for for clever in Greek is etymologically directly linked to awakening. And awakening, I'm pointing this out to say what happens in that moment of apprehension is witnessing the distinction that brings things together. I find that very interesting because that's actually the opposite of what dreams do. It's almost like that's a distinction, that's the move, right? So why is the operation of finding unity in distinction, why is that different in the activity of quickness of wit and the apprehension of the encounter that this is that, the bring before the eyes? Why is that different from dream fantasies of the imagination? The reason why is because in that bring before the eyes and drawing forth the unity is a clear distinction. That's other, right? So that's the major mode. It's not the forgetting of the other, it's the remembrance of the other. So that's why, yes, Daniel, your note by memory is 100% correct. I think on that note. By the way, building on this, Aristotle's note about phronesis is because phronesis is considered practical wisdom, right? So it's subdivided up. It's broken down from Aristotle in Enigmatic Ethics. It's that word for cleverness. So you have to be able to enact, but finding the particular thing to enact on it, to get the result of it, and it requires moral virtue. So this actually draws it back one more time. Intellectual activity is not divorced of the moral. It's actually very much dependent on it, which was one of my major claims in my health course, that you don't get intellectual activity without moral virtue because you need memory. Memory is dependent on the body, et cetera, all that good stuff. So that leads to my last note. I think Michael's note about liquid glass and how it operates as in those kind of using all the internal structures of nature to create effects. I think that's really important because actually one of the major notes of encounters of the beautiful is are things held together by adhesives or binders? There is a distinction. So for example, and actually at least the relationship of smoothness. So here's the thing. The reason why most buildings were not these super rationalist, smooth, perfect geometric shapes, because it was really, really, really hard to make the smooth shapes, but it was also really, 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 really hard to be precise enough to get the corners to connect together. You've got human error or just materials themselves, etc. So you would need pattern and basically all the, actually that's the thing. In nature, it's just like in nature itself, all pattern comes from differentiation at the edges of limit. It's at the limit encounter of two things combining which differentiation of pattern and intricacy shows up. So we actually artisans and artists and architects and makers always knew that. You always find the detailings at the edges of a two materials coming in contact. And that had a very practical reason. You had to hide your mistakes. You had to hide and also those binders of the details at the edges that create a pattern. It also usually were the forces that held the objects together. So this is also very important. And nature is the most perfect of this. So that's the whole point. Aristotle comments, why are things of nature not just a bundling of sticks? Bundling of sticks is adhesive. So you're using basically a rope, right, to artificially bind things together. Versus nature holds things together usually by either, again, we know from chemistry, covalent bonds or ionic bonds, either the sharing or transfer of activity, which is also very interesting, right? Which is also the nuance here, is that what artisans are kind of borrowing in their objects of beauty and the structures of beauty, things like that, is when the internal forces, this is from Christopher Alexander, the internal forces are harmonized, aligned, so that they cross either share or transfer forces that bind themselves together, that hold themselves naturally together, versus using external operation of force to hold them together, which, by the way, that's what money is. Money is an external object of force. That's what it is. Which on the note of natalism is a very big aspect of it. Beyond the money question, besides, it's a very trick question. Because before we use this language like social capital. When you used to be part of communities, we had family nearby. The grandparents took care of the children or supported taking care of the children, or brothers and sisters in their households, the clan, basically, the clan model, right? We're part of larger communities that we took care of one another and shared the loads of obligation, taking care of children. Or, for example, actually, when you're poor, if you didn't have a car yourself, but only one person in the area had a car, you would all hop in the car and go drive to the town to go pick up your supplies, for example. You were forced into convivial relationships, right? So notice that money abstracts away the need for that. It's an adhesive. It's not a binder, to use that kind of metaphor language. And I think that's quite important because that's actually articulations of the beautiful, that's the tension, right? So what do we do in a space where everything's adhesives now of money, finance, interest, glue? You know how many buildings are just glue? Everything is held together by glue. Modern construction. I've seen videos that talk about it. It's like you see glue upon glue upon glue. And you're not going to get the beautiful by doing that. But obviously we're in this reality. So what are we going to do? We're going to just LARP and try to get the old stuff back? It's not going to work. Because all you're going to get is as a pastiche kind of remember or recall, right? A LARPing. So that's the challenge here, is to have a better understanding of what does that nature of the beautiful bond mean, both in relationships, community, and objects too.
Magnificent, and further evidence that everyone needs to take your class. Absolutely outstanding. And if anyone has anything else to say this evening, please, before I run. I think what you're saying about nature entailing, well, there's many things. First, before I forget, Mr. Satori, the point you're making about there being something in transhumanism that's good, right? Because you're not going to accept the limit of getting sick and dying. So there's something in transhumanism that has a spirit that is actually very important. The issue is that without beauty, we can't sublate it. Transhumanism, without the right metaphysic, I would say, is going to overfit and become auto-cannibalistic. It's going to say, okay, well, transhumanism is the spirit of not accepting limit. And that very spirit would then, if you just take it forever, means you get rid of all limit. When in fact, you should get rid of you ought to get rid of every limit that isn't actually a limit. But the issue is, the assumption is, well, what if there is nothing that actually is a limit? Well, you have to make that absolute choice. You have to make that final absolute choice, right? And Michelle and I were just talking about how so much of human development, it would seem, is actually finding these key pivot points where the very thing that made you, say, thrive in the past is actually no longer that which will continue your thriving. The example, and to actually know to switch, but I think it's very difficult to know to switch or how to switch without philosophy and people to speak with, like you find individuals. Like the example we were making is that you need willpower for individual optimization, to say, you know, willpower is very important. But then when you get into social dynamics, willpower can actually make things worse because you just assert your will more over the other, or you kind of just basically can also feel entitled because you've been working so hard and you've trained your willpower so much, and that can kill the relationship. What ends up happening is as you move into social or relational settings, you need to transition from willpower often to something more that we've been calling relinquishment, which is where you surrender. There's more of a surrendering. Like you surrender your self-image, you surrender your control, you surrender needing to know everything that's going to happen. Like the example that Michelle was making of that, oh goodness, Mr. Satori, wonderful. The example Michelle was making was the mother with children, is that when a mother has a child, then if the mother never lets the child go, there's a relinquishment, the child doesn't develop. But there's a certain way in which if the mother loves the child, they wouldn't relinquish, right? So there's something contradictory about relinquishment that if you never engage in, you don't develop and you get various pathologies. And yet the very thing that brought you to the place where you proved having to make a choice of relinquishment is precisely a motivation and way of thinking that would keep you from relinquishing, perhaps willpower or love or so on and so forth, right? So that very dynamic is, I actually think, what's kind of at play with transhumanism, is the very thing that has gotten us to the place, the overcoming of limit in certain senses, has gotten us to the place where we have to make the final absolute choice before our AI calls her, to use that language in reference to Mr. Luber's work. Then it is precisely brought us to a place where we have to be like a mother and actually switch and move to a relinquishment, which is to accept limit. The mother accepts a limit when they let the child go. I can only do so much for the child. I can't actually hold them forever. I am limited from giving them everything they need. I cannot give them their full development. There is a certain thing that they have to give themselves. Well, that's a limit. But that very lack in the mother in this sense, to not be able to give the child everything they need, is not nothing. Its acknowledgement is everything. And there is something about transhumanism being, and frankly, AI and the movement of rationality itself, it has all been motivated by a proper spirit to this point. But now it has to transition into relinquishment, or you're going to get pathologies. And I think that macro story is actually manifest for individuals on their own life. I think what you were saying there, Mr. Jockin, on dreams is very important. For me, dreams are a kind of they're a kind of fake. They're a kind of they're the goal, but in a fake way. It's because there's no insight. The way you were putting it is there's no real difference. There's no real, you're not having to tarry with difference. It's just you're free of it. And so you have to go through the work. Like another way to put this is that any limitlessness that you achieve from limit versus with limit is a cheat and very, very destructive. Like there's a weird way in which limitlessness with limit for Hegel, the true infinity, is in a sense more limitlessness than limitlessness without limit. Because limitlessness without limit has a contingency. There can't be a limit. But a limitlessness that is achieved with limit is actually more powerful because it has limitlessness even if there is limit. So it's non-contingent. That is the weird thing, is limit affords the possibility of limitlessness precisely because even in the contingency, you can tarry with it in a manner that you're not bound by it. And so there's a limitlessness in limit that is greater than a limitlessness without limit. And the problem is dreams in this sense are a lesser limitlessness precisely because you didn't do the work of tarrying with limit. And there is something about what the human is supposed to be, is the shepherding of the being, per se, that is afforded by the limitlessness of limit, in limit, because that's actually more limitless than limitlessness without limit, to say the word limit 5,000 times. It does make me think in the Christian tradition of the idea that the problem with Satan's temptations in the wilderness is you were going to achieve the ends of God's plan without going through the work. You were going to cheat, right? You were not going to go through the cross, as the Christian might say. Likewise, the problem with a dream is you're achieving the ends of freedom from limit from limit, not going through negativity, not working with it, which actually then means it's more contingent and it's weaker. To that point as well, I love what you were saying about money, Mr. Jockin. There is something in how nature form binding shared activity as distinct from this aggregate or this adhesive. It would almost in a certain way perhaps be that the work of the human being is tied to the ability to spread shared, to increase shared activity and to share binding. But the problem is we can confuse that with the simulacra of the aggregate. Like when I think about the geopadic, as you, Javier, and Michelle have spoken on, there is something about what you are doing there is creating a new kind of form in a way, if by that we mean a sharing of activity, a new kind of binding. And there are only so many kinds of binding that nature can make. Like nature is a revelation of the possibility of binding, if I just use that language, as distinct from aggregate. Now, our work is to figure out how to do that regarding things of which shared activity is not already given by nature. Like there's a certain work that has to be done in order to figure that out. Like, so how does the social, and again, as we've said before, it's basically the choice of the AI causer, is the question of if we regain the social, which in the 18th century, with the birth of boredom and industrialization and all of these things, is the 18th century is defined by the birth of the social. We couldn't handle it, so we chose the logic of capital to mediate our relationships because we couldn't handle them so directly. And that wasn't necessarily a mistake because it gave us space by which to develop the capacities. And I don't even think we could have developed the capacities to handle the social without the social coordination mechanism. But you are now in this moment where you have to choose if you're going to keep you're going to now choose capital, the logic of capital, as Marx would say, in a way that is overfitting, or if you're going to say, no, we're going to relinquish the logic of capital now to regain the social. Well, the social must be a binding. Mr. Jockin, thank you for being here, sir, and I'll throw it to Mr. Sartori. The logic of the social must be a binding, not an aggregate. The problem is we basically defined the social by the aggregate and the adhesive of money. Now, that does not necessarily mean that was a mistake, because that adhesive could have set the stage for then the possibility of doing the work to create a shared activity as the social, ergo the form. It's just a question of what we do now. But now the question of regaining the social is about the possibility of individuals and human beings somehow creating shared activity, a binding, a new form, I would even say, a form of people. And that's friendship also. I mean, friendship is not an aggregate. Friendship, as we've talked about with Jockin, like friendship is more of a binding. It's a shared activity. That is the characteristic of the social. And that makes me think of Aristotle, where friendship and the political are two sides of the same coin. So what would it mean to do the work of making the social? Because that is, but the problem is the social can be Lovecraft. One of the reasons why we did the aggregate is because the social can destroy you. Like people can destroy you if you're not able to handle it, right? But so much of the work now is time. Mr. Luber, thank you for being here, is actually figuring out how to create and spread shared activity, not merely aggregate. And what does that even mean? Well, I think even if it's hard to say what it is in a definitional way, you definitely recognize it qualitatively when it occurs. You're talking and 3 hours go by. You're laughing the entire time. Like you're with people and it's like exactly what you've always looked for. Everyone knows it's the jazz improvisation. When you experience relationships that have the quality of a shared activity, a binding, not an aggregate, you qualitatively can tell. You can qualitatively tell. And I think that makes sense because in the same way, like in the Bible, you can tell the presence of God, but you can't look directly at God without being destroyed. Similarly, it would see, and I think we see that in nature. You can't directly see form, but you can see the effects of form. Likewise, you can see you can tell there's a shared activity here, even if not directly. So I think it goes with God. So I think it goes with human beings. And there are qualitative experiences that occur that are evidence that this is there is a binding here. Not merely an aggregate, but the problem is the modern world has told you if you can't quantify it, it doesn't exist. Well, you're doomed then. Like if the only things that exist can be quantified, well, quantification is aggregation. That's what that is. So then everything that is real is an aggregation, not a binding. It doesn't have form in the way Mr. Jockin was saying. Well, in that way, of course, you get reductionism, as everyone talks about with the meaning crisis. Of course, everything becomes individual and separated because nothing is actually together. Nothing is actually together. It's all individualist and hikikomori, of course, because it's all just aggregate. Aggregate is a term that means nothing is actually together. It's just collected together. And then, of course, nothing is actually holding it together. So when people run out of money, then people become hikikomori, for frick's sake. So you have to have a shared activity. But a shared activity is something that people cannot just turn a light switch and do. There's virtue and conditions and choices that have to be made so that people can do it. And you have to choose to live your life in a manner that maintains that, and then to have the memory of that choice so you can continue to orient you as pressures and bills and other things start coming on. And I think that is tied to this question of what the human is and the way that Mr. Lubu was talking. But let me stop and throw it to Mr. Satoy. Mr. Satoy, please.
Yeah, I think that thing about, friendship and wanting to have the person, that you can share that experience with. I mean, I think that is in the sense of like God creating humans. That's where it has to be that he had to create man with somewhat of an upward striving, and then he in the incarnation, meeting us where we are at in that moment after we've, after the prior thousands of years of history of trying to figure it out on our own, and then he kind of changes that's in a sense maybe humanity experiencing that friction so that they can get straightened out, before we just go into pure destruction or whatever. But I was thinking about, like, even with God makes Adam, and then like he cuts Adam to make Eve, and that there's like something about that there is always going to be that cutting, that cost, that painful thing, and then so that and then it's interesting because then Adam in his he's got a wound and she doesn't, and it's like, does he does she have to be equally hurt to become equal, or does she or does he not perpetuate that on her instead? Like, it's kind of an act of mercy. But I was thinking about girls. Oh yeah, because I was thinking about the plumb line thing, because it's like, okay, to get that first fixed position or whatever, you have to do it the hard way. You have to do it through friction, through grinding. But then, you can have, once you have your fixed points or whatever, the string, which is flexible and incapable of producing straightness on its own, can trust, you tie it to that fixed point, it trusts, and then it falls straight. And so I think in some ways it's like God chooses us, we undergo a painful process, but then we can choose to then use, our agency or whatever, I think, because I think that's the thing that's increasing, is because the human, the frightful, fearful aspect of humans that fears others becoming like God or becoming greater than they are, it always seeks to limit agency. And it's dangerous to increase the agency of the other. The other can be dangerous, that's, that there's obviously that tension there. But, it's, if we choose to, having been changed, then we're going to become the fixed point. We're going to be stable, so that the flexible other can hold on to us, and become that reference point. I think that's like kind of the whole thing with the absolute choices, to stay in a marriage, to have a child. And the more people do that out of the desire, I think, to make the world comprehensible, to make it, to purposefully use the choice to not to go away from deception, to go away from stories that paint us in a picture of exaltation for our own purpose, then that's kind of the restorative process that allows us then to have the equal, because that's essentially, I mean, that's what you do with children. You have to put in all this effort so that you can elevate them up, so that it can become your friend. And that's the whole thing. If you try to make your kids your friends, you do them a disservice. But if you treat them as children, eventually they will become your friend. If you try to do it the other way, they resent you. You lose the parental relationship and the friendship relationship, both. And I think it's probably the same thing in marriage too. Maybe, yeah. So
magnificent. And I think what you were just saying about, and then alas, I'll run everyone for work. What you were just saying about being fixed in order to make the world intelligible for others, this point cannot be overstated. Because very often, we talk all the time with the loss of Given's belonging again, and how thus reality is not intelligible. There's a way in which when you choose to give yourself, say, over to a tradition, and we'll just say Christianity, it is not simply about you making reality intelligible to yourself, because that, Jordan Peterson, maps of meaning, you require that. But you're actually also doing an act of which is helping make reality intelligible for others when you do that. Because if you choose to be fixed in it, right? And so there is a way where today, for me, I experience this, when Christianity is not quote unquote given, like it is chosen, one of the things that can help you choose it is also just the kind of knowledge where you say, I am choosing to bind myself to something to help make the world intelligible to others. If I do, it actually is a kind of act of helping others make the world intelligible. Now, this is extremely obvious when it comes to children. If you play the game, which I have, and you just have to get, if you're looking for the perfect church, for example, or the perfect theology or whatever, you're not going to find it. It's not going to happen. And so you always have reason not to give yourself over to a church or something, right? But if you say, well, actually, the reason I'm going to bind myself to this church is because I'm helping make the world intelligible for my children. This binding is actually if I don't do this, the world is going to be less intelligible to the children. But then the key is that the church is going to fail them. The theology is going to fail them, and you're going to be there for them when it fails. So you're binding yourself to something so reality is intelligible, but then you're also going to be ready when that form of that map proves not to be the territory. You say, well, of course it's not. And you prove to be the parent. It's yeah, I know that, versus the parent that says, how dare you, and get mad at them, right? So that's the kind of key. You're in a very real way as a parent, I think, having to kind of very intentionally give yourself over to a map that is not the territory, and you just do the very best you can relative to the conditions. Because if there's not a map, you have to have a map to have the experience it's not the territory. You need the experience it's not the territory. Not to literally, you can't go straight to the territory. So you need a map to fail, but you need a map to fail. And you as the parent need to give yourself over to a map, or it won't function as a map. It will just be an option. It will just be, a map is something you use, dang it, that you commit to. It can't just be on the wall. So you have to give yourself over to something. But I think the key is to kind of know it's going to fail. And Cadell will mention this on the idea of kind of being the big other in the Lacanian sense, knowing the children have to kill you, that you have to die, that you have to you have to be a fixed point that fails as a fixed point, but you're ready for that. And that's going to occur. And that's actually the suffering servant in a sense. That's Christ-like. There's a certain death that you're giving that makes way. So there's really something to be said about giving yourself over to something to help make the world intelligible to other people. Because if it is not, then anxiety overwhelms them, and they also then never get a map that they can experience failing. And really the development of the person in fullness is in the experience that the map is not the territory, the quote unquote girdle point. The girdle point is where full development occurs. If you never get to the girdle point, there is something that doesn't develop. You can see this in forms of fundamentalism. You can see this, though, in forms of anti-fundamentalism that never commits to something, right? Well, if you never commit, then you never get the girdle point, because you have no internally consistent system to unveil a girdle point, right? So there's a lack of commitment, and there's an overcommitment that can lead to a failure of development. But that means you have to give yourself over to an internally consistent system, knowing it's an internally consistent system, that it is not the fullness of being. And you kind of have to, in that sense, set yourself up. But it's just so important, I think, to kind of have this sense, and then I'll say a few more things before going, Mr. DeClerc, good to see you last. I will have to go in a moment, Mr. DeClerc, for work obligations, but we're talking, but Mrs. Tatoy was making just a very important point. You have to, as a parent or as a person, say, I'm going to choose to give myself over to this church and commit to it, even though I know it's imperfect, because this is kind of an act of love or friendship or storge in this certain way of, if nobody fixes themselves in anything, then life is not intelligible for anyone. So I'm going to choose to fix myself to stuff, which has this effect of, for the overall social, of making intelligibility possible. And so without that absolute choice, you're not going to have intelligibility. And the key to why we talk about the absolute choice versus a choice is an absolute choice is precisely a choice that you choose to give authority over you. Like you choose to have it be a necessity that guides you. Like, because you say, I'm going to choose this thing as if it is absolute, which means that I'm not going to unchoose it. Like I'm going to actually have it impact me and cost me something, right? Like there's another way in which you could say absolute choice is always the prerequisite for a belief. If we make a distinction, say the difference between an opinion and a belief is that a belief costs you, right? Like it costs you something, whereas an opinion, like I would argue most people say have an opinion on pro-life, but not a belief, because their belief on pro-life hasn't cost them anything, right? And that's really important. Like you really should go through your life and look at the matters. What matters do I call a belief, but actually it's more of just an opinion, and something just turned off because you've never actually had, you haven't done the work of actually having it cost you something. But I think, you have to fix yourself, or reality is not intelligible. A few more things. I definitely think that also without that absolute choice, if nothing is, here's the other thing, if nothing is fixed, then there are not truly different things of which would make the possibility of shared activity occur, and thus there can't be a shared form. Because that's the weird thing. Like a form requires difference, but the difference affords the possibility of a shared activity. So if nothing is fixed, there's nothing really different in a certain way, and therefore you can't have shared activity. You can only have aggregates, which is an appearance of shared activity. And actually, when the bundle of sticks is unbundled, they all fall away, and that becomes a major problem. I think also I'm now thinking about, there's a way in which, if in Christianity there's this idea that God wanted a relationship with man. There's a way in which we could say that God wanted a shared activity with man, not an aggregate. Like God didn't want an aggregate, he wanted a form, he wanted a shared activity, he wanted a harmony, right? Like God was not looking for something that he can add to the list of the things of creation. I've got zebras, I've got giraffes, I've got trees, just something to add to the list, right? Like an idea of, say, the difference between man and perhaps everything else in creation is that there's something about man where God didn't just want it to be another thing of creation, but having a shared activity with God, like a certain form with God, which gets into the image and likeness stuff. So that's the stewarding, that's the shepherding kind of stuff. And therefore, God did not want an aggregate with man. He wanted a shared activity, a form with man. And I do think so much of our work is actually, like, if there's this idea that God created man so that man could create, the question becomes is, like, what is man to create that is not idolatrous, right? Well, I think what we're supposed to create is basically form, like shared activity, the social, like shared coordination that is not merely an aggregate but a binding, right? Because that is nature. Nature has already, in a sense, nature already does its own work of creating shared activities. It creates forms, the tree, the natural scaling laws. Like, we're surrounded by a creation that already kind of creates its binding, not just aggregates. But we as human beings, like, we have agency because we can create new shared activity. We can create new form, right? Like, there are forms that we can make in the city. The city is a form, right? A shared activity. It has a life that's not reducible to individual activities. Like, we can create new form, and there's a way in which to be, if we're also even wanting to say, to go back to the alignment idea, that if there's a way in which human beings are to be aligned with being, which is always a dangerous notion, but you hear it from Thomas. It just depends on what you mean. It can be true. But there's something about this, that the human is supposed to be aligned with nature, right? Like, to do what is natural. Now, this is dangerous because then it can sound like technology is bad and nature is good. But nature is not a word that just means trees. It can include technology. But there's this idea that the human is supposed to be aligned with nature. Well, what is nature? Nature is an expression of forms. Okay. It is an expression and unfolding of forms. All right. So human beings to be aligned with nature is to help with the unfolding of forms. Well, what are new forms not found in nature? Cities, technology, medicine, the social. These are forms not found in nature. And so, weirdly enough, the only way we align with nature is to do that which seems unnatural. The city, technology, all of these actual things. But these are actually manifestations of new form. The problem is that you forget that these are an expression of new social activities, and thus they overfit. And that's why the battle of agency is also tied to memory. And furthermore, the technology has to be done in a way that continues to honor the shared activity. But because that demands virtue of us, we then tend to use the technology to avoid the social, to individualize, to escape other people. But if technology in its point is actually the extension of form and shared activity, that is to use it against what is supposed to be used, because you are no longer using technology aligned with its own nature, which is form, which is the expression of form, the making of shared activities, not mere aggregates. And so in order to then have transhumanism be an expression, because transhumanism can absolutely be sublated. It's not an innate bad thing. It's just an innate bad thing if it forgets form, if it loses memory and alignment with nature in this certain way. But if transhumanism is properly aligned and sublated, then it becomes a way by which we extend shared activity, by which we create form. But we're only going to do that, thank you, Clayton, if we have the courage and virtue by which to do it and to resist the temptation of technology to actually isolate us from other people, to use technology to not go through the cross. It is just the temptation of Satan all over again. Are you going to realize the things that God has planned for you with the cross or without the cross, through negativity or not through negativity, with limit or not with limit? And that's the final absolute choice. And I think if we make the final absolute choice for limitation, then this actually will help express technology in alignment with the spread of shared activity and form, of which it is precisely that, I think, that is the creative activity that human beings are supposed to do to be in the image and likeness of God. But thank you so much for your time, friends. It is always a pleasure to speak with you. I will now run and unfold a bunch of chairs. Best to you now.